Hi, welcome to this edition of ArmCareIQ. Today we're going to talk about separation and stretch loading in the delivery. We already talked about the kinematic sequence, which is the sequential order of peak speeds and how segments move, and particularly rotation about the transverse axis when we're looking down on the athlete. And it's going to be a good one. It's going to be pretty technical. I'm going to let you know that right up front. We're going to go through some graphic analyses and get your head wrapped around separation, hip, pelvic, and trunk separation, and how those things differ between pitchers of different ability. If you guys like what you're listening to, please like us on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. We also have a link to our newsletter, which we give deeper insights into these ArmCare IQs, links to our podcast, and as well as incentives on our products. And here we go. So let's talk about hip and shoulder separation. This is a really important feature of the delivery because when you think about our bodies, we're connected by fascia and other tissue and muscles, obviously, and they stretch and cross patterns. And so when the pelvis is rotated one way and the trunk is another, you can think that we got this stretch across a diagonal band in our body from our lower hip. Let's just say I'm a right-handed pitcher on my left side to my throwing shoulder. And this elastic band is responsible for a lot of energy in the delivery. And so making it more efficient has not only performance benefits, but also health. And so I want to refer to a study that was done. I really like it, that looked at two patterns of throwing. And essentially they looked at early rotation. So pitchers that had foot contact, they had a lot of their shoulders showing, essentially. And also late rotation. So guys that could stay closed more at foot contact, and generally better pitchers are more closed at foot contact. And those that have, issues with velocity or command, they tend to swing open. However, you're going to find a whole array of pitchers at especially the professional level that will not have such great what we call dissociation or separation. So when you look at the two patterns, pattern one is our efficient pattern, a lot more shoulders being closed. And so, when you look at video, some scouts say that this pitcher has big hips and skinny shoulders. That means they see a lot more of their hips and less of their shoulders. Or in the pattern two, this could be an athlete that's got big hips, big shoulders. So it's kind of swinging around at the same time like a gate. Or it could be big shoulders, skinny hips. So the hips might be closed while the shoulders are opening. So that happens in terms of video analysis without even needing a motion capture system. But you can see the two different deliveries. So the pelvis is the gold or orange color, and the trunk is the blue color. And basically with this particular illustration is you're seeing the relationship of angle change between both. So let's start with pattern one. You can see that the pelvis is swinging past the trunk while the athlete's at peak knee height and going into the descent down the mound. And then what happens is that pelvis swings through till about foot contact, okay, where you're going to see the max separation, where you're seeing the pelvis is well ahead of the trunk. You're seeing the arrow, basically the forward-facing direction of the pelvis and the forward-facing direction of the trunk are gapped. There's a big space between them. But you can see the point of what I call singulation. When do the pelvis and trunk come together and you can't make angles between them? So they're even with each other. So you can see here at about a negative 100% time, so 100% time before foot contact, you can see in pattern one, the better pitchers, the trunk and the pelvis are aligned. So the pelvis is now passing through the trunk. The trunk's still closed, the pelvis is still closed, but now the pelvis is starting to swing open. And now we know something about the motor control of the trunk of this athlete. Can he keep his trunk back, or is this starting to swing open? Okay. So you can see they're both closed. And even at foot contact, with the more advanced pattern one, they're still staying closed. Okay. And then the interesting thing in pattern one, they start to singulate again at 80% time at maximal external rotation, which makes sense. At maximal external rotation, you want your pelvis and your trunk to be aligned in the direction that you want to throw. Okay. And when you look at pattern two, this big hips, big shoulders, the guy that doesn't have great separation, can't keep his shoulders back at foot contact, you can see that at negative 60% time that they singulate. So there's a lot bigger swing between the pelvis and the trunk early at negative 300% of time, so 300% time before foot contact. But you can see very, very close to foot contact is where these athletes start to singulate, because they start to roll together a lot closer to foot contact. You can see the angles between them. The separation is a lot less at foot contact. That's an important feature. Now, the other thing is because they're swinging at the same time and they don't have the motor control to stay separated, is that they're singulating again well before maximal external rotation. So the pelvis and trunk are coming together well before maximal internal rotation or maximal external rotation. But then you can see at maximal external rotation, the shoulders, the torso are now angled away. They're not head on in the direction that they're throwing. They're starting to over rotate towards the glove side, while the pelvis is staying straight. And then at the point of ball release, they got a lot of rotation past the pelvis. So that's just an easy way to be able to show you what the pelvis and trunk's doing in terms of hip separation, okay, between the two deliveries. So let's get into singulation a little bit more, okay? So in the previous kinematic sequence, we talked about sequence, the order of events, essentially in terms of getting to peak speeds between segments. We talked about segment speeds. We talked about the slopes being accelerations and decelerations. We talked about the speed gain, how much speed is going to be differing between segments, particularly for the pelvis and the trunk. We talked about the speed ratio. We want to see that at 1.5 to 2 times the torso or the trunk velocity relative to the pelvis. That means we're transferring energy very well. The stretch between the pelvis and the trunk is telling us that we're translating a lot of elastic energy, but we also need to know the stretch. And this is what we're talking about today, the separation singulation. And all athletes do not have to have an optimal separation. The key is to keep the time frame between the singulations when the pelvis and the trunk are going to line up together. I know it's really difficult concept, but that tells you the time of the stretch, which is important between them. That's kind of allowing you to know the loading pattern. So again, let's go to the graph on the left. You're going to see, okay, this is our good pattern. The guy's got big hips, skinny shoulders. That means that he's able to keep his trunk rotated away while his pelvis is rotated towards the plate at foot contact. Okay, so what you can see is that the pelvis has more of a negative angle at the beginning, okay, before this singulation point. So during this point of peak knee height, you can see this little image at the beginning towards foot contact. You're going to see the pelvis is more negative. It's moving in the counterclockwise direction more than the trunk. And then what happens is you hit this peak set, you hit this singulation, this S period, okay? So now they hit singulation at negative 100% time before foot contact. So it's happening before foot contact. Pelvis and trunk are aligned together because the pelvis is swinging through. But what you can see during this period is now the pelvis line is going ahead of the trunk line. So that means the trunk is now further behind the pelvis. Okay, so now we're creating separation, okay? And then we hit the singulation again, very close to maximal external rotation. It's almost right at it. And what you can see is there's a long time frame between the two dots, negative 100% to positive 100%. So there's a big time frame between these two dots, and that's an important feature, is that there's a lot of time between this stretch and then this recoil coming back to each other. And I want you to pay attention that you can see space between these lines because it's telling you the angle of the pelvis and the angle of the trunk. We want to see a lot more space. Most, better, higher performing pitchers do have a lot more separation, and we want to see that there's an adequate amount of space between those lines. Now, when you look at the second graph, now it's a guy that's got big hips, big shoulders. Things are swinging around at the same time. They're not good at decelerating certain segments of their body and having the motor control to hold the trunk back. You can see now its point of singulation is very close to the foot contact point. Okay, so you can see the image of the foot contact. You see that the time frame is closer. And then again, the visual on the other side is now when the athlete singulates again, and the trunk is catching up to the pelvis and they angle together, they're not angled towards home plate. They're kind of off axis. They singulate mostly towards the right-hander's batter's box is what I'd say if this is a right-handed pitcher. But when you look at the distance between the dots, the time frame is shorter. there's not a great amount of stretch time for this particular athlete. Okay, they don't have this early singulation. It's a late singulation and before foot contact, and it's early singulation before maximal external rotation. And you can also see that the distance between these lines when the pelvis is ahead of the trunk, so there is separation angles created because there is space. It's much smaller. It's definitely much smaller. And we could be losing elastic energy in that particular case. So to make the graphs a little bit more meaningful of just looking at separation, we can essentially create these valleys. And all we're looking at is the separation angle between the pelvis and the trunk. So when you look at the axis, they have this as negative. So this tells you how many degrees the trunk is further behind the pelvis. Okay, so it's negative. And what we're seeing in the dots, again, these are the singulation points. We're talking about when the athletes singulate and there's no stretch between them. And what you can see is that the better pitchers, this pattern 1 at foot contact, it's got this big angle difference between the trunk. You see the trunk is either at 90 degrees, if I'm right-handed facing third base at foot contact, or it's rotated back some. And the pelvis is rotated further around. And then you can see on the other pattern at foot contact, the pelvis isn't opened up that much and the trunk is a little bit more counter-rotated, but they're going to start to swing together. And so when you look at this particular graph, you want to see, when you look at a separation graph, you want to see a wide and deep valley. So a lot of your programming that's responsible to improving separation, even sequencing, you want to, if you're going to look at separation angles in this kind of detail, you want to see that the pitchers are getting this wide and deep valley on this graph. That means that there's a lot more time between the singulation periods and the angle difference. So you're getting, deeper and deeper. That means there's more difference in your separation between the pelvis and the trunk. That means the trunk is rotated further back when you get deeper and deeper negative numbers. Okay, so that's important to look at the graph that way when you're assessing your pitchers for their separation strength. Okay, now we get to the fun stuff. So when we just talked about separation and singulation and the importance of the stretch response and keeping the shoulders back, there's actually a biomechanical mechanism that can keep you healthy by having more extensibility and motor control in getting separated. And so on the graph on the left, this is internal shoulder rotation torque. So that's essentially the torque that is bringing the arm and accelerating it forward. But you can see that the peak is actually happening before maximal external rotation. You can see in the image, there's a small silhouette of a guy with his arm laid back. And what it's telling us is that the highest peak internal rotation torque is happening as an eccentric torque. So that means that it's slowing down the layback. And that's an eccentric stretch of your internal rotators, your internal rotator cuff. So that's important to note where that's occurring because there's a connection to the elbow that I'm going to be showing you next. But in a study that looked at late onset of rotation versus early onset of rotation, so late onset, you would still have that big hips, skinny shoulders, and your early onset, you're going to see big hips, big shoulders at foot contact. You can see that the pro level out of all the adult groups, so pro, college, high school, you can see that the pro level has the latest onset, and it actually has, out of the adults, the lowest internal rotation torque. So because they're able to stay back and stay closed, they're able to manage that layback torque that is decelerating going into maximal external rotation better than all the groups. And then obviously the youth, they're the earliest onset. Those guys are just kind of thinking about how to rotate appropriately, and they're developing their mechanics. But a lot of those have open trunks at foot contact and not enough hip trunk separation. And so you can see, because they're smaller, they're not throwing as hard, their internal rotation torques are lower. And that's just physics, force equals mass times acceleration. They got, a little bit of mass and they got a little bit of acceleration. So you're not going to get very much out of them. But in your pros, they throw the hardest and they had lower torques than the other adult groups because they had a later onset of trunk rotation. And that has to do with what we're talking about in separation. So the next connection, and I know we talked about the internal rotation torques for the shoulder, but you can see the varus torque. And the varus torque, we're talking about the elbow. And the varus torque indicates the valgus load because it's the resistance to opening of the inner elbow. And you can see that that peak happens really close to the internal rotation torque peaks. They're very connected. That if you don't manage layback very well in your arm, in the eccentric component, you may spike your varus torque, and your resistance of valgus loads would go up. But you can see they happen very close to maximal external rotation, lay back the arm. So a lot of the big injuries, slap tears, medial elbow sprains, those things are happening. Those ulnar collateral ligament sprains, they're happening in layback. They're not really happening that much in acceleration, because you can see where those loads are highest. But when we looked at the same thing with this particular study group, I was evaluating, and the researcher's name is Arnel Aguinaldo, great biomechanist, great stuff, puts out great research. But what he had found is that athletes that opened up early before foot contact, they actually had greater valgus loads. So that spike would have been higher in that particular group. And then when the athletes had later onsets of rotation, so post-stride foot contact, they start to, rotate their trunk around. Those athletes had lower valgus torque. So it's important to delay trunk rotation, and that comes with stability, motor control, extensibility, coordination. And so those are really important features in keeping the athlete healthy, to evaluate this particular trait. So I don't want this to seem salesy, because I really believe in our product, and this is why we want to put together an offer for this month. And we've talked about singulation and separation, and how important this is to the torques on the shoulder and elbow. But the thing is, these things change all the time. Fatigue is going to cause the connection between the pelvis and trunk, the kinematic sequence. All these things are going to change with fatigue, with increasing throwing loads in games, just training changes, lack of sleep. There's all these different factors. But the one thing that we can be rest assured by using this product is we can ensure that the arm is in its best condition, because what we offer is data-led assessment and training for the throwing arm. And so, to combat any other biomechanical inconsistency that could happen, especially if athletes do not have, large separation between singulation, they don't have a lot of separation, they're early trunk rotators. If you find that with your athletes, wouldn't you want to make sure that their arm is in the best condition, knowing that they could spike up in arm loads? So it's important to kind of mirror this strength and biomechanics piece. And, we're hopeful that you'll enjoy our product, and we just want to keep the baseball world healthy. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this ArmCareIQ session. Until next time.